Welcome to 1984 Lore, and today we focus on telescreens, one of the more infamous instruments of control in George Orwell's nightmare world of Oceania. Telescreens are one of the essential elements of the party's total control in the superstate of Oceania. It was really with the invention of it that private life effectively came to an end, and the near total surveillance of all party members began. Telescreens both transmit and receive simultaneously, with any sound louder than a low whisper being picked up, and the screen itself enabling a wide field of vision to snoop on party members. The technology had not developed to the point of recording in darkness, which gave a small window of privacy if the comrade remained quiet at night. However, totally escaping the incessant propaganda and programming was impossible. Outer party members not only endured their presence at work and in any public place outside of remote country areas, but also had to accept their own allocated telescreen in their own homes. Winston notes that telescreens were usually placed on the wall that commanded the best field of vision, though sometimes, as was the case with his, placement can sometimes create blind spots where a comrade can escape its gaze. In the novel, Victory Square is said to be full of telescreens. The corridor down which Winston both receives Julia's love note and is also approached by O'Brien also had one. Winston later reveals too that telescreens are ever present in toilets when he considers reading Julia's note in there. Unsurprisingly too, in Winston's cell, a telescreen occupies all four walls. In more rural areas, such as the so-called Golden Country, in which Winston and Julia began their love affair, telescreens are likely few and far between. However, even so, Julia does suspect that even out there could be places where microphones are hidden. Winston was also fairly certain that no microphones were present during his earlier hiking trip with his wife Catherine, let alone any telescreens. Their reach then does seem to have limits. Indeed, to think that such devices could be installed to visually monitor every outside and public space is practically impossible. No outer party telescreen can be turned off, and the volume can only be dimmed and not muted, meaning that presumably even throughout the night, programming would continue, and during the day more vociferous announcements and programming would bruise the ears with statistics, songs and other party propaganda. One issue of controversy regarding telescreens is whether inner party members can really switch them off. Assuming this was a genuine privilege, demonstrated by O'Brien in his meeting with Winston and Julia, O'Brien does add that even for comrades of his rank, it was not wise to switch off their telescreen for longer than half an hour. Unfortunately, like much of the lore of the book, we simply don't know if this was a genuine perk of an inner party member or not. I tend to think not, or if it was, that few inner party comrades would have been daft enough to exercise it. Having the privilege to turn them off doesn't mean you should. Being able to turn off the telescreen, or at least seem to, was essential for O'Brien's deception at the meeting. Only once Winston's fears regarding it had been assuaged would he fully expose his own thought crime and eagerness to join the Brotherhood, and so it proved. Furthermore, Winston was replayed his own words, confirming what he would do for the Brotherhood later on during his interrogation, these damning statements perhaps recorded by the telescreen. Incidentally, even if inner party telescreens were fitted with an off switch, to actually use it was probably not wise for obvious reasons. Turning off a telescreen for any amount of time would likely imply some foul play to the watchers. We know that inner party comrades are not immune from the stringent demands of the party, with some comrades being arrested and vaporized. Jones, Aronson and Rutherford had been purged, as had the less well-known comrade Withers. An interesting thought to consider is that perhaps the ability to switch them off was real, but that it was more granted as a test than an outright perk. Why would any inner party member, supposedly the most committed and fanatically loyal adherents to the principles of INGSOC and to Big Brother, ever want to switch off their telescreen? In O'Brien's case, he of course required his to be temporarily switched off, or at least made to appear to be off, in order to trap Winston and Julia. On this particular issue then, I think it's unlikely that the ability to switch them off was genuine, or at the least was intended as another way to root out disloyal persons within the inner party itself. A further common subject regarding telescreens I'd like to address is that the party watches all individuals at all times. Contrary to this common belief, telescreens are only imposed on party members and public spaces. The old problem then of how everyone is watched constantly is quite answerable, with the more plausible task being the surveillance of party members, and even then, likely mostly outer party members. If you're wondering why non-party members are not required to have telescreens in their homes, this is simply down to the belief that the proles are not considered threats. Being too crushed by poverty, distracted by their work, their lives and entertainment, not even mentioning party propaganda, proles are not educated or motivated enough to pose a real threat to the power of the party. At a stroke, this removes around 85% of the population of Oceania from the population of those requiring telescreen surveillance, though even so, this still leaves millions of party members who in theory must be under constant threat of inspection. Practically, it's simply impossible for all party members to be watched all of the time, with the much more likely scenario being that the more publicly placed ones are indeed monitored constantly. Winston believes, for example, that the screens placed in the toilets were likely always watched, though the fact he highlights this also implies that he believes there are others that aren't constantly watched. Another factor here is routine and time. The world of 1984 is very much a place of routine. There's a time for exercise, a time for the hate, a time for eating and so on. Key scheduled announcements and programming would also likely be times that party members would be monitored. During these times, it's likely all party members could conceivably be checked in on, if not watched for too long. The beauty of Orwell's dystopian world is that he always keeps things vague. It's possible then to imagine a more automated system of surveillance in which human watchers were not necessarily required. Of course, I'm not suggesting Orwell specifically envisioned this, but that the ambiguity of his writing does allow for it. Another thing to consider is the potential effect, a term I've just made up. Just because party members know statistically it's quite unlikely they're being closely monitored at any given moment, does not mean they can ever know they are being inspected. This creates a culture of self-policing that in itself reduces the need for perpetual monitoring of all comrades to begin with. More likely then, every typical party member can expect to be inspected several times a day for short periods, usually at flashpoints in the day, but can generally be assured at night and other quieter times that they are not. Key times when a comrade could expect to be monitored more than usual, in my opinion, are during exercise routines, at the 2 minutes hate, and in the canteens. It would not surprise me if the telescreen footage of every 2 minutes hate is inspected for potential face crime or any indication of abnormality or such. Certain individuals who have already exhibited signs of thought crime are almost certainly monitored constantly. The best example of this, of course, is Winston himself. Winston was instantly scolded by the instructress for not trying to touch his toes. He was also quickly screamed at to uncover his face and take his hands out of his pockets in the cells. Indeed, it's highly likely most major events in the novel, from Winston's seconds-long lapse in his facial control in the 2 minutes hate, to Julia's staged fall in the corridor, from their mumbled conversation in the canteen following this, to O'Brien's approaching him later on, and much more, were all watched and carefully recorded. If we recall most of the major events carefully, we can see a telescreen was nearly always present. The only time I can think of is Winston and Julia's meeting in the Golden Country. So, if we construct a mini hierarchy of monitoring to finish up, at the very bottom of the pile are proles, who require no surveillance, or very minimal surveillance at the most. Inner party members are probably monitored, but given their fanaticism and loyalty, they are regarded as lower risks. The largest group are the subdued ranks of most outer party members. These individuals largely self-police and require some, but not constant inspection. Finally, the much smaller pool of individuals that are under constant surveillance are those outer party members already suspected or exposed as thought criminals. This group will likely number in the thousands across Oceania, but are still manageable. So, what do you think? Am I wrong? Are all party members watched all of the time? Or is this unrealistic? Write your thoughts about this issue and about telescreens in general in the comments. And remember, Big Brother is watching you.